Hello, one and all. I'm Tom Hassan, and I'm president of SWA, if I haven't had a chance to meet you yet. Joining me tonight are Jamie Broderick, France class of 71, and Ansley Carlisle, who's China class of 13. Delighted to have you both here with us. Before I introduce Jamie, our moderator for tonight, just want to let you know how excited I am that we're almost the end of the first term for our 3 campuses over in Europe. And the kids are having an amazing year. Yes, it's a little different. There are some restrictions, including wearing masks, which, you know, is a challenge for those trying to learn language, but they're doing great. And I hope you're able to follow what's going on through our SWA Now electronic newsletter that you get once a month. And so we try to highlight stories. I know the one that's come out is about some of our travels that we had with classes. So that's a little bit of SYA. I also want to know that very exciting news that we finished our capital campaign, our first one ever. And we actually had a very ambitious goal and we exceeded it. And I want to thank Jamie in particular, because he was one of the co-chairs of that campaign and was a marvelous organizer and facilitator, and helped brilliantly move us along, including the fact that we did a lot of the fundraising during the pandemic. So that's just a real testament to folks like you who are invested in SWA and want to see SWA continue in its all strength in the future. So thank you one and all for that. So tonight, let me introduce Jamie, whom I say will then introduce Ansley. And we know Jamie way back, well, SWA does, from his time in Rennes. He was a class of 71, so one of the first classes in France for us. He then went on to Harvard College after graduating from Exeter, and he studied Arabic linguistics and Near Eastern languages and civilizations there. He then went on to study the same for a PhD at University of Chicago. Today, his work actually is as director of Impact Investing Institute, which is an independent, nonprofit, United Kingdom organization that aims to accelerate the growth and improve the effectiveness of the impact investing market. Before that, he was head of the UBS Wealth Management in the UK, chief executive of JP Morgan's asset management European operation, and he began his career at Wellington Management Company, an independent asset management partnership in Boston. So Jamie, what I really want you to do is talk about the right turn that you took from your PhD in Near Eastern language and civilization and into this investment world. So I'm going to turn it over to you so you can start with that. So again, thank you both, Jamie and Ansley.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks for the invitation to be here with you. And thank you to all of you who've joined us this evening. The answer to your question, Tom, is that the fact of the matter is that the number of vacancies in Arabic linguistics in the United States the year I was looking for a job was about 1. There would be 1 position that would open up in the entire country. And when my son was first born, my wife and I had a heart-to-heart discussion about employment prospects. And that's the point at which I went into financial services, and I've been there for 35 years and never regretted. So I did start out as a language and linguistics person, but I made the pivot. Very happy to have done that. But we're not really here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Ansley Carlisle. And Ansley, I'm going to ask you to do your own bio, because you've got an interesting bio, and I think that's really part of what we want to be hearing from you, and it's certainly not from me. But so we're here to talk about venture capital and a little bit on impact investing, and there's an overlap between those two things. But let's start by, if you wouldn't mind, Ansley, could you define venture capital? What is venture capital anyway, and how is it different from other forms of investing, and how is it different from private equity?
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Tom. Thanks, SYA. Thanks, Jamie, for having me today, and everyone who's online. I'm glad to be here. I'll start with a quick background on myself. As was mentioned previously, I'm class of 13 for SYA China. I went on to study chemistry and environmental engineering at Spelman College and Columbia University, respectively. Then took a job with ExxonMobil in Houston, Texas as an environmental engineer doing air quality control or air quality regulation, essentially. Was there for about a year and a half. Really enjoyed my time there, but just decided to make a career change and got into venture capital as an investor at Mark Cuban's family office. And I've been here since February of this year. And so I think it's great to open with that question, what is VC? To be honest with you, I certainly didn't know when I was applying for this role. It kind of found me, and it's been like drinking from a fire hose often. But venture capital is essentially, I guess, the textbook definition. It's a form of private equity where capital is invested into early stage companies at the, you might hear the term seed stage or Series A stage. So the earliest stage of a company's kind of life cycle, with the expectation that there will be a significant return on that capital. So upwards of, like, you might hear a 10x return on that capital. Where it's different from private equity, though, colloquially speaking, private equity is usually referring to investments, larger investments in more mature companies. And so whereas a VC investment might be, maybe $10 million, up to $10 million, a private equity investment might be $100 million, where the private equity firm is really looking to buy out the company and operate it.
Okay, so you're really talking about startups. You're talking about a little bit after a person sets up a company.
Yes.
Then that goes into venture, and then at some point, presumably, if it's successful, then you pass that company on to a private equity firm that would fund it at a later stage of its trajectory, right?
Yeah, that's one of the exit options. Another exit option would be an IPO or maybe acquisition by a larger company. But yes, a VC would be looking to kind of offload that startup, I'd say within 5 to 10 years.
Okay, so these are not listed companies. They might end up being listed, but at the stage at which you're operating with them, they're not listed. Okay.
Exactly.
And I would just say that the reason that we're interested on the impact investing side, I mean, impact investing is where you invest with the intention to create a social or environmental impact and get a financial return. And the reason we're really interested in venture is that we like to focus on new capital. So we distinguish between new capital and recirculating capital. So when you buy a stock on the stock market, you're really recirculating capital, and you're selling your stock to somebody else. The company actually doesn't get additional capital. Whereas in the business that you're in, Ansley, people are bringing new capital and making something happen that wasn't going to happen. And if it's impactful, then that's where we get excited, because that's an impact investment. So there's plenty of venture capital that is also impact investment, and that's kind of that's the interesting part. So let me ask you, I want to go back to your background a little bit. I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about the transition from school year abroad in China, and then back to high school, and then into college. And was there a connection between your experience in China and where you ended up going into college, and how you visualized your college career?
Yeah, I think that, gosh, after SYA China, I think, and my friends would probably say the same, I think that I opened myself up a little bit more, both to people and experiences and opportunities. And I think that that's in large part what led me to pursue a dual degree program. So I mentioned that I pursued a chemistry degree at Spelman College and then an environmental engineering degree at Columbia. I had my sights on Spelman for a while. Spelman's a women's college and an HBCU, but I also knew that New York was this whole new world that I, hadn't experienced and had heard so much about. And I think that staying at Spelman for all 4 years probably would have been the more comfortable thing to do. But I think that after SYA, I just really valued having a more international, I guess, kind of learning environment. And I felt that Columbia and New York would provide that for me. And so I think that SY just kind of gave me a bit more confidence. And you know, I'm sure you and other alumni and current students on the call could attest to this too. But going abroad for a year, you learned so much about yourself, you learned so much about the world. And so I think I just carried that with me in my decision to, you know, have the experience that I wanted at Spelman, but then also to go on and experience something else in New York.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I would say after a year in China, you know, New York ends up, it doesn't look so intimidating, or you look a lot more manageable. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, so now you work for Mark Cuban. Now, Mark Cuban is the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. He's an interesting person. I guess he made his first billion when he sold broadcast.com to Yahoo.
Yeah.
Made a bit of money that way, and then he went out and then set up Mark Cuban companies, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So tell us about that business. What's it like? I mean, what do you do? What does the company do? And then what do you do within that?
Absolutely. I think interesting is a great way to describe Mark. And I'd use that word to describe my experience at his family office as well. So Mark Cuban Companies is Mark's family office. We are an industry agnostic firm. And so that means that we look at investments across all industries. That said, we don't have a mandate to deploy capital. And so most venture capital funds, or I imagine even private equity funds, have what we'd call limited partners, who are either high net worth individuals or institutions who invest money into a fund, and then the fund's managers have a responsibility or even an obligation to deploy that capital or invest that capital into companies, I believe, within a set period of time. Because we are not set up that way, although we're industry agnostic, we have what I would call a bit of a higher bar for our investments. And so, you know, we're looking at lots of different deals, but you know, and maybe this sounds trite, but it really has to be something exciting, something that's, you know, either, you know, IP that's protected, that's differentiated, a company that's doing something that's really different in order to get our interest and ultimately to get Mark's interest. And so I think from that standpoint, it's been really fun to get to talk to founders who are essentially on the cutting edge of the different technologies that we're looking at. You know, I'd say that a lot of the companies that we look at are in the AI space, deep tech, blockchain. Most of Mark's investments outside of technology come from Shark Tank, and so he does do deals in CPG and food and beverage, but most of that comes through Shark Tank.
What's his relationship with Shark Tank?
So Mark is a investor on Shark Tank. He's, gosh, I don't know how many years he's been on Shark Tank, but probably one of the more notable investors there. His investments there, gosh, probably again range from technology to consumer products to services. It's really, really varied.
So I guess everybody in the audience already knows it if they watch Shark Tank. I don't. I live in England, so I watch Dragon's Den, which is our version of Shark Tank. So I've never seen the guy in action, but it sounds interesting. And is he involved in the decisions, or is it people like you who decide which companies go in, which ones don't? Does it all kind of end up going past him for an assessment?
He is involved in the decisions, and I've worked a little bit with the Shark Tank team, and so I've gotten a little bit of insight into how that world works. But from what I've heard, it's actually like what you see on TV is what's actually happening in real life. So he has no knowledge of the investments going in, and when he makes a deal, he's making a deal. That said, after after he does make the deal, we'll go in and do some due diligence on the back end just so that he has a better understanding of the investment that he's just made. But it's real life.
Okay, and what's your real life like? So what does your work look like what does a day look like, and what kind of activity do you do? I mean, it's not a big office, is it?
It's not a big office. I'd say there are about 30 to 40 people in the office in total. Most of that's back office and legal. We have about 3 people on our core venture investing team, and then another 3 to 4, maybe 5 people on the Shark Tank team. So a pretty small investment team. My day-to-day varies. It kind of depends on the day. A lot of the work that I do, so I'd say I'm between like an analyst and an associate. A lot of the work that I do then is due diligence. And so as you can imagine, Mark just generates a lot of his own kind of deal flow with founders pitching him directly. And so when he's interested, he'll pass those deals along to my team, and then I'll just start digging into the market, the competitors. I might reach out to the founder to get an introductory call going, and then I'm writing up an investment memo and making a recommendation on whether or not to move forward. And so that's the bulk of what I do. I'd say maybe 15 to 20% of my time goes into supporting portfolio companies. And so again, because we have companies that range from tech companies and like crypto and blockchain, all the way to a peanut butter company or something. The needs of our founders vary pretty widely, but essentially whatever they need, whether it's hiring support or building out a budget, I would be there to support them in that.
So Ansley, how does that work? I mean, if you're roving across industry, you said you were industry agnostic. If you're roving across all these different areas, particularly in technology areas, does that mean you need to become an instant expert in these different industrial sectors and technologies? I mean, how does that actually work? Or are you looking for something? You're looking at something different?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think most VCs might tell you that yes, they're experts in the industries and the companies that they're looking at. I think that I have learned to always defer to the founders that we work with anytime we're talking about expertise, and so it certainly does require, I think, you to be a fast learner, and so finding resources quickly to get up to speed. And then, if there's a trend that Mark is really interested in, like we have someone on our team who's kind of become the resident expert in blockchain. You're just kind of reading up on that constantly to stay on top of the trends in that space. I've kind of started to become our resident expert, or one of our resident experts in food and beverage and consumer packaged goods. And so I'm just always reading up on that. But yes, I mean, it's impossible to be an expert on all the things that we're looking at. And so it's really relying heavily on the relationships that we have with just kind of people in our network. And so portfolio company founders, and then other VCs in our network to better understand the different spaces that we're looking at, and then just kind of being good on your feet, learning as much as you can.
And what's the balance between judging the business proposition and judging the founder?
That's a great question. I think
well, I asked the question in part because a lot of startups have a great idea, they go into that, they then execute and start to get smarter about their market and end up pivoting. They've learned enough that they say, oh, this isn't the way to go, we have to go this other way. So with that pivot, the business proposition that was pitched to you could evolve. Whereas the founder is the founder. So the founder is a constant, the business plan might be different. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it probably really depends on who you're talking to, and so I don't think that there's a general answer, across all VCs. I've heard some VCs say that they index heavily towards the founder fit, and so they're really looking for smart founders or founders with high IQ and EQ, and and they have a system for, identifying great founders. Again, every investor has their own perspective, and it just happens that Mark, that's not the most important factor for Mark. I think he's really looking at the product and, as it's pitched to him, that day. And so he's looking to see, is there product market fit? Do you have, protected IP? Have you, do you have a lot of users, or what's your market penetration? And he's less interested in founders. And I think it's because, it can be really hard to judge a person accurately over, one or even a series of Zoom calls. And so I think that's over time probably just become a little bit less important to him.
One of the interesting things, when I looked at the MCC website, I took a look and I noticed that you categorize your companies, in fact, by founder. So you say, are they founders are women, minorities, or military? And I thought that was really, really interesting. And here's why. Because most of impact investing looks at what the company is doing. Is it doing, is it creating better healthcare? Is it reducing carbon emissions? Is it creating efficiency somewhere? But you're looking at not what the companies are doing, you're also looking at who actually controls the capital. And it's such an interesting, and I think really enlightened approach, which is to say that when you have an impact on society, it's not just what the company is doing, but also who's controlling the capital. And you've got some disenfranchised groups, or groups that aren't participating as much as other people. I would include women and minorities. And so I was really interested to see that you have that categorization. And is that something that MCC feel, or Mark Cuban feel strongly about?
I think so. And I think it was really intentional on his part. I don't know if he would consider himself to be an impact investor, but I think that certainly a lot of his actions have shown him to really value investing with impact, I guess you could say. And so, I've seen him be intentional, even with our investment team, about seeking founders of color or women founders or military founders to invest in. And, even though we, again, I think that this probably falls in line with our office not having a mandate to deploy capital. We don't have specific, targets on X number of investments need to be, but I would certainly agree that he has a intentional kind of focus on supporting founders of color, again, women founders, military. And I think it's, I think that Mark is probably at a point in his career where he's not only looking to make more money on top of the billions that he already has, but he's really, wanting to do good with that money. He says, or we say in our office all the time, that we really like to put founders first, whether that's founders that we've already invested in, so portfolio companies, or founders that we're looking to invest in. And so, I think developing relationship with those founders is one of the ways that we do that, but certainly deploying capital to more diverse founders is important to us.
Yeah. I want to pick up on one of the questions that's come in the chat, which is a question about impact investing. Is that an investment that impacts on the investor's portfolio, or it impacts society? And I'm going to answer that myself and say that an impact investment is one that impacts society and the environment positively. And it's not a statement about what it does for the investor's portfolio. So it really has to be doing something positive for somebody else. And so it's interesting that you say you don't identify as an impact investment operation. And I would say in the United States, venture capital, generally speaking, attaches a stigma to the word impact, because it implies that there's some kind of concessionary investing or do-gooder investing going on. So it's not a term that's used at all in US venture. It's used a little bit more in Europe. There are people a little bit more comfortable with the concept. Either they're comfortable that it doesn't necessarily mean it's concessionary investment, or they're comfortable that that's okay anyway. But it's just it's a real taboo in the U.S. and so it's not used there. The other question that Jorge had, which I'll punt over to you, is: has there been a transition for VCs toward green investment?
That's a great question, and I would say absolutely. I came into this role really wanting to develop a pipeline of clean tech investments for us. That's an area that Mark has invested in the past, but I don't think with a particular focus on that area. Since I've gotten on board, I frankly have just tried to learn as much about everything as I can. And so I've become somewhat of a generalist, and wouldn't say that I'm an expert in that space by any stretch. But certainly as I keep up with trends in venture capital and in clean tech, yes, I absolutely believe that there's a movement or a transition. And kind of going back to your point, Jamie, I think that more people are seeing investing in the green space, green investing, clean tech investing as profitable investing. You know, you've probably heard this phrase before, but doing well by doing good. One fund that you might look into, Jorge, is it's Chris Sacca's fund, and I want to say it's called Lowercase Capital. Chris Sacca is a notable venture investor. I want to say he invested really early in like Twitter, maybe even Facebook, but made his money in tech and has now transitioned to focus exclusively on clean tech investments. And he's been very outspoken about pursuing these investments, and not from the standpoint of just, you know, doing something good for the world, but from the standpoint of making, you know, venture style returns on these investments like he made in, you know, Twitter and Facebook years ago.
Can you repeat the name? It was Chris who? Chris
Sacca. I want to say Sacca.
Okay. I need to ask you this other question because that's one that's really interesting to me and one where I'm a bit active, which is: what are some of the ways that VC can be introduced to or made more accessible to underrepresented communities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's an issue that's actually near and dear to my heart. And as I've developed my network in VC and connected with other women and people of color in this space, it's something that we're actively trying to solve for. You know, I think that part of it is just expanding access to the knowledge about VC. Like I said, I had no idea what venture capital was, wasn't really that familiar with financial services in general, but certainly had zero familiarity with venture capital. And so, you know, I think that could look like lots of different things. But, you know, when I was on campus at both Bowman and Columbia, there were career days and there were companies that would come and visit and would be very aggressive about, you know, recruiting all students, but even recruiting students of color and women in particular. And I think that it would be great to see venture capital firms do a little bit more of that. I certainly don't remember seeing any VC funds out there at career fairs, and I can imagine that that's not exactly something that they see a need to do. I think it's a highly competitive space to get into, and so I can imagine that they're not, you know, hurting for applicants. But I think that it could be good, again, just from an educational standpoint, you know, getting in front of students, the students that, you know, you say DE&I is important to you, so get out in front of students to at least let them know that you're here. I think that's a good start.
Yeah, I think there's lots to be done there. That's a great description. Ansley, believe it or not, we've run out of time.
Oh my goodness.
so we do have to close here, but I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give for somebody interested in breaking into this area? So picture somebody in their 20s or 30s trying to break into this area. What advice would you give?
Yeah. I think that if you decided that VC is is what you want to do. There's so much out there that you can learn. You know, even though like I said, I knew nothing about it, so I wouldn't have even known where to start with a Google search. But even in my 9 or 10 months that I've been on the job, most of my learning has not come from anyone, you know, telling me, you know, this is what you need to know in VC. It's come from finding online resources like, you know, literally YouTube videos or blogs, or, you know, part of what venture capitalists have to do is create a brand for themselves and put their name out there. And so there are just so many, like I said, blogs or videos. There's so much online content that you can just kind of start getting your feet wet. And then, you know, when you know more about the space, you can, you know, either network with people in this space or find ways that you can add value. But I'd say start with, you know, just learning about the space itself, and, you know, get the jargon and the terminology down so that you feel more comfortable as you go into, you know, whether it's VC interviews for internships or jobs, or just start expanding your network in the community.
That's great advice. And it reminds us that learning doesn't stop after school year abroad. There's a lifetime of learning out there. So
absolutely.
We didn't get to all of our questions. Would it be cheeky of me to suggest that people pitch some more questions to us via LinkedIn if that's of interest, in particular if it's career related, because that's, I think, where Ansley, you and I would be really interested in being helpful to people. So if there's something else that we didn't cover that you'd like to, find us on LinkedIn and make some contact there. But we do have to close here. And so I just want to thank you, Ansley, very much for that. It's an amazing half hour to hear from you on venture capital. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us this evening, and thanks School Year Abroad for the opportunity. So long, everybody.
Thank you, Jamie.